And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., three guests to discuss this tonight. Mark Schmitt, Executive Director of the American Prospect and former Policy Director to New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley. John Wunderlich, Policy Director at the Sunlight Foundation. And Katherine Mangu-Ward, Senior Editor at Reason Magazine. And we welcome back David Eaves from the Center for the Study of Democracy at Queen's here in our Toronto studios. Thanks to the three of you for being on the line from your nation's capital to our provincial capital here. I want to start by playing a clip from an interview we did on this program last October with Harvard Law School's Lawrence Lessig, teaches at the Center for Ethics there as well. And he was talking about the push in your country that many people have to have the schedules of congressmen and congresswomen made public. Here's what he had to say about that. Roll tape.
There are many examples of congressmen meeting with people that would be misinterpreted. So, you know, if my congressman met with somebody with whom I have fundamental disagreements with, my own view is that's a good thing. He should understand the view of the other side. But other people could say, oh, see, he's associating with that person, and therefore he's got some tie to that person, and therefore I shouldn't like the congressman.
John, let me start with you because your organization is all about letting the sunlight in, and I want to ask you, is it possible that the release of more government information is actually making people more cynical and more mistrustful of the process for the reasons that Lawrence just outlined in that clip?
Sure. So I think it's always possible that any information that gets released could be misinterpreted, like anything. But I also think that that's not a reason for us to throw our hands up and go home. I think that transparency does, in fact, it doesn't always lead to more trust, but that doesn't mean that we have to become cynical. I think it makes it possible for politicians to earn our trust. So it doesn't, while it doesn't necessarily lead to trust, it promotes conditions where politicians are more likely to do the right thing and earn our trust. Okay,
but Katherine, is more trust what you want at the end of the day?
You know, I'm actually not sure that more trust in government is a good thing. I will say that there's one thing I'm not worried about, and that's too much information being out there. If every congressman has to release his schedule, every congressman has to think twice about who they meet with, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I would also say, though, that the idea of trust in government being inherently good is a bit misguided. I mean, if you have a man who is cheating on his wife, you don't say, well, maybe we shouldn't let the wife know what his schedule is because it might undermine her trust in him. We know that she deserves that information.
I understand that example, and I don't think that's the analogy that Lawrence from Harvard was going after here. But I think, Mark, what he was suggesting was that if you know your political enemies are going to use against you any meeting that you may have with someone who may disagree with you on an issue, then you will only talk to people who agree with you. And how can that possibly be of benefit to citizenry at the end of the day? Isn't that the point?
I actually think, I think that Professor Lessig, I take a slightly different point, and I think the points he made about transparency were extremely important. And that is that very often when we talk about just kind of dumping whatever is there's some existing thing, it's the calendar or some bit of data, what you wind up with is very partial information. So that knowing the name and, you know, maybe the employer or whatever of somebody that a member of Congress met with is one data point. To understand it requires a whole lot of other things. Why were they meeting with that person? What was that? Was it social? Did they go to college together? Was the member of Congress trying to hear the other side of an argument where he'd only heard one side? There are a million reasons, but you need all that other data. So I think very often, I don't want to say there's anything dangerous about data. I don't want to not put out the schedules, but I think we want to think about making sure that we're creating the structures where when you have one piece of information, you find ways to have the other information that actually helps people use it to be good citizens, not just to say, aha, you met with some polluter or some big contributor or the head of a bank, but that you're able to put it in context right away. And
that's a key.
I think, where those dangers come up.
Let me pick up on that with you, John, because clearly you don't get any context at all if you just publish a senator's schedule without any indication of why he met with the person or why she met with the person, why it was important. So the publishing of schedules alone, can it not have a negative impact on politics?
Well, that's possible, but I think we're talking about something much bigger than just the question of a schedule, and it's easy to pick an isolated case that might have a negative consequence. But if you look at the argument that Professor Lessig is making, I think you could apply the same argument to the budget and say, why should we release the budget or the appropriations that Congress makes? Because they could be taken out of context and we could get a skewed vision of what our country's priorities are. So really, you could make that argument about almost anything. So I think it's one that you should use in context and carefully. And generally, I think we should trust the evaluation of the public at large and recognize that it's really easy to say politics is harmful and releasing that ammunition might arm politicians. But politics is also intended in a democracy to be the defense of the people in order to make their own decisions.
No, fair enough. But David Eaves, on that example of, do you think that's a right analogy, that releasing a schedule of a politician is the same thing as releasing the budget of the province of Ontario, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I do, and frankly, I'm even actually kind of surprised to hear this argument, because
Which argument?
That we would be talking about this, especially from people in News Corps. I mean, either you believe in public debate or you don't, and so you trust that the public can understand information and hash it through. Not everybody will come to the right conclusion, but that the public discourse is good. And so we release because we believe that. And if you don't, then there's all sorts of things that maybe we shouldn't be releasing. And I'm not sure I want to go down that path. That feels a little scarier. And the second piece is, when you do release this information, yes, there's context, but releasing this piece of information creates demand for context. And the final piece is, once it's out there, there's this kind of assumption that the system will continue to work just as it is. When you release a piece of information like this, you change how the system works. Maybe people will start to learn that actually it is good for my congressperson to meet with people they disagree with. It isn't going to be just like the way it is. And so we begin to shift how that system operates.
Okay, but Katherine, let's talk sausages for a second. Because you know the analogy I'm going for here. There's two things we should never see made, and that's laws and sausages, because it just grosses you out when you see what happens. And of course, in your country, the whole healthcare debate shone a bit of a light on that. However, one of the goals of open government is, of course, to make people feel more part of the political process, and it may be more difficult to do that if people become more cynical or more disengaged from politics if they see, quote unquote, how the sausages are made. So is it a danger in the open government movement to reveal, how do I want to put this here, not just the bad parts of government, but of course all the potential possible good that can come out of letting the sunshine in as well? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I'm gonna see your sausages and raise you another gross food metaphor,
okay,
and say that that information is chum. If you throw a little bit of information out there, you're gonna get the bigger fish. You're gonna get more data. If you release a congressman's schedule, you're gonna get a congressman scrambling to explain why they're meeting with everyone, and I think that's a good thing. As far as the sort of fear that there's too much information or that people might become cynical when they get this deluge of information, I think that, you know, going back to the Facebook example is a great one. It's pretty rare that people make a friend on Facebook, decide they know too much about them and don't like them anymore. Instead, Facebook makes people feel more connected. It improves friendships and relationships, and it opens up the possibility of a whole nother level of relationships where you're not maybe best friends with people, but you kind of know what's going on with them. And I think we might like that as far as a model for a relationship with the people who govern us. I'm
going to play devil's advocate, Mark, one more time with you on this one. And this is going to sound incredibly elitist, but hang in there with me. It's just it's something provocative I'm just going to throw out there. Do you believe, I mean, unlike all of us on this program tonight who really love politics and maybe love it a little too much and care about every little nuance that goes on and really like to get into the nitty-gritty, normal people have normal lives. And they have to, you know, they can't eat, sleep, drink, breathe this 24/7 as we may. In which case, can so-called ordinary people, ordinary members of the public, draw the right conclusions when dealing with this raw data? Or at the end of the day, is it really going to be about, and I'm sorry, this happens all the time nowadays, is it really going to be about giving, more ammunition to the enemy of the people who are in politics to beat them over the head with?
Well, I think the answer to that is just to really think about kind of making sure that we're adding other data to the data we have. It is hard, you know, it's amazing what people do with data and there was a lot of good examples of that in the first segment. There's always somebody out there who's going to do something interesting with it. But in a lot of cases, you actually need to add, we don't put out the budget just a bunch of raw numbers. And if somebody gives you the budget for, your show or something like that, I just actually had this at work. If all I have is raw numbers, I'm not able to work with it. I need the analysis. I need to understand what the background is for something like that. And I think what we need in order for people to be able to not just, hold politicians accountable, but actually participate as citizens with the data that's available to them, they need something. They need some analysis. They need some help. They need some other kinds of information, and that's what we ought to be focusing on. There's a great example of this when I worked on Capitol Hill, when I worked in the Senate. And this is pre-internet, just before the internet. There was a tremendous little wave when we were considering the North American Free Trade Act. And everybody started calling our office and saying, we want to read NAFTA. I want to read every word of that 2,000-page document because Ross Perot or somebody suggested I should. I want to access government. I want to read that thing. And so we were madly Xeroxing copies of this treaty and sending it off to people. And of course, you could read NAFTA, and not reading this text and how it changed one provision or another just isn't going to help you in any way understand whether it's going to cost the U.S. jobs or gain the U.S. jobs or whatever people really wanted to know about it. You needed to give people a whole other level of analysis. So all I'm interested in is seeing that we're adding the other aspects that help people really engage on top of raw data. And some of that citizens are going to do by themselves for other citizens, but some of it we actually need government to provide other kinds of information and journalism to produce other kinds of information.
Okay, let me read an excerpt here from Tim Wu at Columbia University, published in the New Republic last October. And he writes, "Consider C-SPAN, the technological marvel of an earlier age. Though the network is good entertainment and has taught politicians new forms of grandstanding, it has done little to improve government. There's nothing wrong with televising Congress, but it is to the American polity what Diet Coke is to the fat man. What I mean is that many transparency systems simply create an incentive to create a good impression under the dictates of the system. Just as food manufacturers manage to produce fat-free and low-calorie food that isn't necessarily healthy, politicians will produce information that suggests even-handedness even if there is none. Meanwhile, the chance of a transparency cure producing real change is close to zero. Does anyone really think that posting a schedule online will make a politician into a better leader?" Okay, let's get into that. David Eaves, what do you say on Professor Wu's suggestion that the chance of creating real transparency is next to zero?
I actually think his statement's deeply problematic.
Deeply problematic.
Deeply problematic, because he's looking at a technology that's broadcast. So I agree, C-SPAN has not done a tremendous amount for increasing the transparency of government. But that's because only certain people are allowed on C-SPAN, and only certain people are allowed to do an analysis of what's occurring on C-SPAN. And actually, the people who use C-SPAN the best are The Daily Show. I mean, they've shown you what can happen when someone's actually able to access the data and manipulate it and do things with it and do their own analysis. That's the excitement. The internet is something radically different. Now, all of a sudden, I mean, this is about empowering ordinary citizens to be able to do their own analysis and share that with other citizens. So C-SPAN is a technology because it's terrible to look at because only I can observe. Open data on the internet is data I'm allowed to use, do an analysis of, and then share with everybody. That's a radically different technology.
Well, let me try this, John. Just as politicians over the years have learned how to game C-SPAN in your country or in our country, CPAC or Queen's Park Television, whatever, won't they learn how to game the internet as well and sort of throw it all out there in a way that works for them?
So just because something is subject to being gamed doesn't mean that it doesn't have a value. So elections and electoral politics are all about gaming the system and getting as many people as possible to vote for you. But that doesn't mean it's less legitimate. And things like when there's a debate on the floor of the U.S. Senate, I don't think many politicians are convinced by that debate, but no one would ever seriously consider throwing out that process because it's still a valuable one. So I think it complicates things to try to take the idea of political deliberation and have that be the target for transparency. Really, that's what taking the example of putting public schedules online does. That's really one of the toughest targets we have. And where we are as a society and as a culture with our new expectations based on technology, there's so much that can be improved on mine safety data or health data or information about bills so that you can see what a bill actually says and then call your representative with your opinion. So those are really some of the pieces of low-hanging fruit we're looking at now. And the question of will all political deliberations become public, that's really a much tougher question.
Okay, Katherine, let me do the follow-up with you then. Again, this is a story not so much about technology, but about people at the end of the day. And the suggestion is, even with all of the technological innovation that has taken place and that you're championing, politicians, in fact, themselves, their roots, their goals, they don't change that much. So can technology really take us there, in your view?
Well, let's take the example not of the politician, but of the man we were speaking about earlier, the rationally ignorant guy who's really not much of a political junkie. I think what open government promises, what transparency promises, is that on the rare occasion that he finds something that he cares about, when something touches him, say he's a plumber and there's a new zoning regulation, or just when he's in a fight at a bar with someone and he wants to settle it, if we can up the chances that he can Google the answer to whatever question he has, I think that's better for everyone. Even if politicians keep doing exactly the same dumb stuff they've been doing all along, even if the general population remains sort of cynical and disengaged, every now and then, if you could get a piece of information that used to be accessible only through a months-long Freedom of Information request process or a series of phone calls and is now available in, as you say, 0.3 seconds, that's better. That's an improvement. And other criticisms aside, that shouldn't be undervalued.
Well, our friend Mark Schmitt wrote in the American Prospect on March 31st a segment that I'm going to read right now about that which we are speaking. The legislative giants of the past decades, he writes, were not necessarily smarter or better people. What's different is that those men, in the mid-1970s there was not one woman in the Senate, had no hesitation about their entitlement to rule. They never went to town meetings where constituents had read pending legislation on the internet and asked detailed questions about Section 547... Today, we'd welcome the arrogance and insularity of those giants who bravely cast unpopular votes. Progressives have been asking both legislators and the president to be more arrogant, to exercise the raw power of the majority without hesitation. But how much real democracy would we have to give up to recreate the environment? With accountability and transparency come legislators who are going to be a little less sure of themselves, a little more worried about each move. It's hard to separate the arrogant bravery of the giants of the past from the isolated white male entitlement that produced it. Mark, what is the potential for too much transparency? I'll follow up with you since you wrote that piece. What's the potential to make politicians and bureaucrats too timid to do the job?
Well, I think we're in a transitional period here. I mean, I was really writing in response to a lot of people who are saying, why was it that, we have all this trouble getting health care passed, and back in, the 60s they could just, move forward with Medicare or things like that. And I do think that the isolation, the kind of closed room, and even when I worked in the U.S. Senate about 15 years ago, it was still a very closed environment. That makes certain things possible, and I think our political process hasn't adjusted yet to the fact that you're going to have to do things in a totally different way, in a totally different environment. So I'm trying to challenge that nostalgia that says let's go back to the way things were, because I don't want to. I don't want to recreate the closed room. I think that politicians will change, and I think we're in a transition period where people move to what's the kind of political process that can actually work and get things done and not impose timidity on us in an environment where you're going to have to assume that everything is open, where deliberations are going to be open, committee meetings are going to be open, conference committees are going to be open, the raw data about what's in a bill, not just at the end, but at every stage along the way.
Okay, let me get follow-up from David Eaves here then.
You think differently.
David Eaves, let me get the follow-up from you, because one of the, we're going through an orgy right now of transparency and accountability, and every receipt's got to be, checked by 6 auditors, or else there's going to be a scandal down at the legislature or Parliament Hill or whatever. And fine, everybody wants transparency and everybody wants accountability, but one of the side effects of all of that is that people are scared out of their minds now to make a mistake. Is this what we want?
No, I don't think it's what we want at all. And here, personally speaking, I want to separate the political from the government. So here in Canada, we have an independent public service. And one of the things that I've observed in the open source space is that it frequently, a new idea that comes along gets panned by pretty much everybody. So if you're a software developer and you're like, we could do this, and you put it out there and you kind of test it, everybody dumps on it. And usually what happens is someone kind of goes off on their own and they kind of tinker and play with something for a little bit, and then all of a sudden they realize, this actually kind of works, and then they take it out and people are like, oh, this is interesting, and now I can build on this. So actually you do sometimes need a private space where you can begin to play with an idea. And I want to recognize that. And that's why, I think we need that. I don't think it needs to be 30 years before we disclose. I think it could be something more like 6 months. But you do need that private space. But in the political space, I'm not so sure that you need that, because there you really do want the rigor of the debate very, very early on. I mean, these are big questions that are often getting discussed. And there's still the private space of your living room where you can have a conversation with a couple of people, and then you can come out and say, we want to test this idea. And if it gets shot down, well, it gets shot down. But that's the way the political process works.
John, what's your view on that? Okay, we're all for sunlight, but more transparency actually could lead to people being more timid because, frankly, they don't want to read about, their mistakes on the front page of the newspaper the next day.
So I want politicians that feel empowered by their relationship to truth and to the substance of what it is that they're dealing with. And so I see the big problem as not being a threat of timidity, but a politics that's based on mistruth. So to me, if the populace at large is more aware of how things actually function, then I think that's good for everyone. Now, at the same time, I want to maintain a safe place for politicians to speak candidly, because I think there's a value in being privately wrong sometimes. So I think that we should preserve that, but at the same time recognize that if we have a choice between arrogance and good policy, I would choose good policy.
So, John, when candidate Barack Obama suggested that the healthcare legislation that your country just passed maybe should have been negotiated on C-SPAN in public for everybody to watch how the thing came forward and made its way through the political process, was that really a dumb idea?
I think it was a bit of a naive promise, honestly. I think given how everything worked, I mean, we've started to reconstruct how that negotiation process happened, and that's not something that you can jam into a room. I mean, the healthcare negotiations happened over a period of months and was thousands of phone calls and face-to-face meetings between leaders throughout Congress and the executive branch. And to really make a rigorous requirement that those healthcare deliberations happen in a room at a specific time, the only way to get that to happen reliably is to ban speech between the people involved everywhere else. And that's what, for example, the state of Florida did. There are situations where you have what are called ex parte rules where people can't communicate unless they're together and lawyers are there. And so since I don't think that's the direction we want to take things, I think we have to recognize that some negotiations are going to be hard to get at.
Yeah, Katherine, let me get you on this because, of course, in your country, in our country, the cabinet does meet behind closed doors. There are no cameras or microphones allowed in there. There's a reason for that. If you really want to kick around some ideas and permit the possibility of looking foolish in advancing what may be an idea ahead of its time, you're not going to do that with the cameras on you. So would you agree that you can't negotiate a $1 trillion healthcare package on C-SPAN?
Two things. First, I'm not sure that this vision, which there seems to be some sort of general agreement would be a bad thing, of legislators creeping around terrified of doing something wrong. I must admit I find that a little bit appealing. I mean, the stakes are very, very high here, and a legislator doing something wrong is an order of magnitude bigger than even the head of a corporation doing something wrong, because it can affect millions of people mandatorily. However, I would also say that the notion that we could somehow abolish privacy, that we could somehow truly remove the possibility of a private conversation between members of a legislature is maybe an overhyped fear. There's always going to be, at the very least, a chat in the men's room while people are washing their hands. Maybe we need to worry about the sexism angle here, but privacy is not in danger. The possibility of a space to be wrong is not in danger. And I think that legislators who feel hemmed in and watched by their constituents are probably better legislators in a lot of cases. Maybe that means fewer trillion-dollar bills. But at that point, we're getting into the question of whether more or fewer trillion-dollar bills are a good thing for our country.
Sure. Let's get into some discussion here about whether or not all of this will lead to actual better decision-making. And David Eaves will well remember the examples we had here in this province several months ago. We had something called eHealth, an attempt to put all of the patient records of the 13 million people who live in this province into some kind of electronic digital form. And it turned into a dog's breakfast. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent. They made very little progress, didn't have very much to show for it at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, what got all the headlines were the very highly paid consultants who, let's say, put some rather dubious claims in for reimbursement. And here's how Jim Coyle, one of our very fine columnists at the Toronto Star, reported on this back in the day. This was back in June of last year. He said, the indulgent use of expense accounts by some of the organization's consultants put things on a delightfully human scale. It's precisely the easily comprehensible scale of things that means this mess is apt to stick to the government more than problems of larger scope. Most folks might have difficulty imagining $18.5 billion, the size of Ontario's rapidly escalating deficit for this year, but no one has any trouble understanding $1.50 for Tim Hortons coffee or $3 for a date square, which were a couple of the items that some of these very highly paid consultants asked for reimbursement for, despite how much money they were making. Mark, let me go to you first on this. You wrote, and I'll follow up with a quote of yours, at a time of economic and fiscal crisis, a focus on the small items, along with the assumption that government is wasteful and corrupt, hardly increases citizens' ability to think about the choices ahead. And I wonder what you feel, how great the danger is that more transparency will make us focus on these $1.50 cups of coffee and $3 date squares, rather than the absolutely massive, bigger, more complicated issues that we really should be wrapping our heads around.
Right. Well, I'm trying to avoid being drawn into this, more transparency is dangerous argument. I'm not going to make that claim. That's not my argument here. What I found when I started looking at some of the states how state governments were looking at transparency of their budget processes was there were sort of two movements here. One was saying, put every single credit card transaction of every state employee on the internet. Every bit of data you've already got, throw it on the internet, let people find what they can. I think when you have that, you're going to have a kind of obsessive, inevitably somebody's going to, spend $150 at a strip club or something like that, and there's going to be, an obsessive focus on that $150. Meanwhile, the other movement is saying, you know what, our budget, we've got billion-dollar billion-dollar tax expenditures in the budget that people can't even see because it's not even really clear that this large chunk of money is for a particular industry or something like that. We're not accounting for those. We're not providing the big picture information that helps people actually think about being citizens. Exactly the example you're using here from Ontario. I want to make sure that you have to do those other things too, and those other things might involve the work of creating a different kind of information and not just dumping what you've already got. So I'm a little worried. I think the only worry I have about transparency is when you say, take the data we've already got and dump it, and call that sufficient, and then people will work their magic on it and calling that sufficient. There's another kind of transparency that has to be brought in here in order, again, to give things context.
David, I want to get your follow-up on that as well, because the irresistibility of the story of somebody being paid $1,000 a day and claiming $1.50 for a cup of coffee was such that it almost obscured the fact that we'd poured $647 million down a sinkhole and had very little to show for it. Are you concerned that the wondrous transparency of getting all of those expense accounts obscures a bigger truth here that we really should be spending more time on?
No, in fact, actually, I kind of almost feel the opposite, which is the only reason that story came about was because of the $640 million. In fact, it was all these small expenses that kind of gave a human face to this problem, and it allowed actually people to identify. They said, what, they're expensing a Tim Hortons cup? And that all of a sudden became a way for them to focus and engage with a much more important and significant issue. I actually think if you just had the $640 million story, a lot of people would have been like, oh yeah, there it goes again. Like there's another great example of $640 million being blown, and we got nothing to say about it. But now all of a sudden there was this new angle that could draw them in and allow them to explore it. So I actually think this was an incredibly beneficial thing.
Now that's a new take. I haven't heard that before. That's very interesting. John, how about this? The small items opening a door to a larger truth? What do you think of that?
So I think we're going through something similar in that our House of Representatives recently released in a digital form for the first time the records of all the expenditures of the offices within the House. And initially the focus was on things like, did Speaker Pelosi buy too many flowers, which I think is a similarly questionable focus to initially have. In the time since then, though, we've seen a lot more detailed analysis go into things like, is the race of staffers at different levels what you would expect it to be, or might there be an appropriate focus on race or gender disparities in the way the House spends money, or what are some other kinds of trends that officials within the House should look at? And that's the kind of analysis that wasn't possible or would be very difficult when those reports were only released in a book form. And then the other big result that happens when we're seeing these new disclosures, if you take the example of the Recovery Act, is that more than creating accountability for the recovery, we're seeing a new focus on the shortfalls of our financial reporting system and how that needs to be much more fundamentally overhauled. So even if you're releasing bad data, it can have the effect of creating a need to fix the data reporting problems.
Katherine, we know that the hope at the end of the day is that more openness and more scrutiny and more public input will, invariably lead to better government and better decision making. And I'd like to know whether you're, 100% sure in your head that you can connect all of those dots. Can you?
I don't think you can, actually. Or at the very least, I don't think that the reason that more transparency might lead to better government is because of the mechanisms of democracy. Having more people involved means, a lot of times, more people focusing on the coffee cup, more people focusing on the flowers that Nancy Pelosi bought. Certainly, it's true that, for instance, in the case of the stimulus money, sometimes the first story is, I can't believe the stimulus was used to buy work boots. The second story is, there's some interesting differences in allocation between Democratic districts and Republican districts. The third part of the story is, okay, well, now let's look at the big picture and see if the stimulus worked. But you're not going to change human nature, and most people aren't going to be involved in government. My hope for transparency is that some of the dumbest, some of the worst, some of the lowest quality sausage, let's say, won't get made. That the natural desire for the splashy story or the obviously ridiculous government behavior will put people inside government on notice and maybe at least slice out the bottom percent. After that, I think it's an open question. But maybe we can't count on transparency to make individuals better Democrats, but we might be able to count on transparency to get rid of the worst of the worst.
But Mark, isn't the experience that most of these folks are just simply not shameable? Even the most egregious expenditures, the bridge to nowhere in Alaska, which Sarah Palin said she canceled, but of course actually did take the money for, they can defend absolutely anything at the end of the day, and all the sunlight in the world isn't going to change that. Isn't that fair to say?
No, I don't think that's fair to say at all. I mean, I do think actually the focus on earmarks in the sort of targeted spending in the federal budget has I think begun to change significantly as people are more aware that you're going to have to defend this thing. Everybody has some kind of logic for how they defend those things. Some things are really indefensible, and I think we're definitely seeing fewer and fewer of them. And I think it's actually a very good example of where transparency is beginning to work. That's partly the initiatives of Obama, Pelosi, and so forth. Some of the scandals that have been associated with that subculture in Congress. But I think we'll look at that particular subset of things in 5 years and see a very different environment.
Okay, John, let me try this with you then. Do you have evidence that more open government, more transparent government, and boy, you go online and you can find out so much about how your government operates and what it spends money on and so on. Is there any evidence that actually leads to better decision making?
Yes, and I have two justifications for that. One is, over time, the idea of what we think of as corrupt has evolved significantly. So it used to be the case that you could be a clerk in a congressional committee and get advance copies of the bills that we're going to pass, and then write an exclusive about that bill that you had an advanced look at and be a high-quality reporter because of your position as a clerk, and then turn around immediately and buy some stocks that were about to go up as a result of the bill that you saw a copy of. And that was just kind of how things worked. That was a perk of the job.
You got a problem with that,
today,
John?
And today that wouldn't fly, right? And I think that I agree that earmarks are changing as well. And so we're seeing some slow incremental steps. And then on the other side, of the equation, I think we see that the kind of expertise that's necessary, the kind of detailed policy decisions that need to be made about technology and science and all these things, the complexity of our economy, are becoming more and more difficult for the people that happen to be good at getting elected to master. So I think there's an increasing need for legislators to look to the expertise of the broader public and help them find the best answers to the policy questions that we face. And I think that's where we're going to see the biggest potential.
John, you're going to get the last word, and I thank all of you for participating in this very open and transparent discussion on the public's airwaves here in the province of Ontario in the country of Canada. Katherine Mangu-Ward from Reason Magazine. Well, that's first of all Mark Schmitt from the American Prospect in Washington. Who are we going to cut to next, Michael? Who am I going to say thank? There's Katherine Mangu-Ward from Reason Magazine in Washington. John Wunderlich from the Sunlight Foundation, also in D.C. Where he is. There's John. And David Eaves from Queen's University's Center for the Study of Democracy up here in our studios in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.